Good morning. Let me first congratulate you for being there after 3 exhausting days. It's always a challenge to organize a conference with so many excellent speakers. So it was really difficult for us to give a decent spot for everybody. This leads us to the 3-day conference, but you all made it. You still seem alive. I will give the word to our session chair this morning, and I just have a very brief practical announcement. Our staff is still there to help you till 1 o'clock. So they asked me if people would like to have some help for transportation, like information on trains, on buses, or ordering a taxi. Please ask them. They are there for that. So they will be there during coffee break and during lunch, but after 1:30 they will be gone. So they really asked me to they offer their help, but it would be kind to do it now during lunch or coffee break, so that you can go. For those who go home today, you can go home safely. So now I'm happy to give the word to the conference co-chair, Tina. So please.
Thank you, Tom. Before I introduce our 2 speakers, I would like to take the advantage of addressing you once more about the possibility to become a member of the IASC. We're always looking for new members, and I think there's a lot of enthusiasm here to expand the field of knowledge commons and related issues. So please, if you are willing to become engaged in the debate, and feel free to contact, in particular, Simone. He does everything for the IASC, including filming these meetings. So Simone is in the back. He's basically the one who runs the secretary of the IASC. And there's some flyers here on the IASC which I will pass on. If you have any questions, please ask me or Leticia or Simone for further information. Okay, and now I have the pleasure to introduce 2 speakers. And first of all, I would like to introduce to you Joel Mokyr from Northwestern University. For me, especially, I think, as an economic historian, it's a very great pleasure to introduce Joel. I know he doesn't want to be flattered, so I keep this short, but just to give you one anecdote about how important Joel is for the field of economic history, in particular economic development and technology change. There was a conference a few years ago whereby the person who had my role back then to introduce Joel asked the audience, and it was a big conference, over 1,000 people. Joel was going to give a public lecture, and he asked the audience whether everybody who was ever in a class of Joel or was one of his PhD students could get up, and about half of the room, and that was a lot of people, got up. So there you go. There you see what role he has been playing over the past few years in our field. He's focusing mainly on technology change, economic development, and knowledge in general, and the development of knowledge in general, and has, I think, the most 2 important works he's been publishing over the past decades are, on the one hand, The Gifts of Athena, on the role of technology in the Industrial Revolution, and more recently, The Enlightened Economy, on the role of ideas about knowledge and how they are distributed for economic development. And I think that is also what he's going to elaborate on today in particular. So I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Let me go straight to the point so that we don't run out of time. Let me see. So, I'm going to start from a slightly different point and then come back to the main theme of the conference, and you'll see in which way I'm trying to connect the two. But basically, I'm interested in the history of useful knowledge, and I'm using the term useful knowledge a bit like it was used in the 17th and 18th centuries, essentially encompassing all knowledge that is potentially useful, not necessarily directly applied. So we would call this, they would call this, in the sense of the useful arts, we would call this, roughly speaking, science and technology. The concepts are more or less identical. And the argument is basically very straightforward, that that is, when all said and done, the basis of our current prosperity, or what my dear friend Deirdre McCloskey calls the sort of factor of 13. She's calculated that we're 13 times richer than people were before the Industrial Revolution. That number is not to be taken all that seriously. But I do want to point out that the economic history has been, for the last few years, been running in what I call the dilemma of modern economic growth, and let me try to convince you of this. So, in the last 20 years, we've had something like an institutional revolution in economic history, following the seminal work of Douglas North and many of his followers, including my own student Avner Greif. Basically, some kind of a consensus has emerged that institutions are central to any kind of economic performance. Not everybody shares that view, but sort of the latest incarnation of it is a new book by two historically inclined economists, Acemoglu and Robinson, in this new book called Why Nations Fail, which is basically entirely dedicated to this proposition. And the kind of things we're talking about when we talk about institutions, which are basically the rules and norms and laws of a society that create an incentive structure, are things that we all know, things like law and order, low levels of rent seeking, good property rights, openness, inclusiveness, effective enforcement of contracts, efficient governments, all those things that are on the board, and we all sort of feel right. But the problem is that these are all the things that do not necessarily explain the main thing that is to be explained, which is technological progress, and that's what I want to talk about, okay? So the difficulty, of course, is that Europe takes the lead in technological progress at some point after 1700. Before that, I think there's wide consensus that the differences between Europe and the sort of rest of the world, particularly China and India, have been overblown. But that after that, there seems to be the beginning of what people have called the Great Divergence. And to understand that, we have to go back, in my view, to the period 1500, 1700, which will be the sort of subject of my next book, in which the sort of preparatory stages of the Industrial Revolution were being played out. And so what I'm going to try to convince you of is that there is an institution that emerges in those days that explains this leadership that Europe takes, and it's sort of the thing in the background, but it hasn't so far been very much emphasized in the new institutional economic history. And so to see this, I want to connect this to the Ostrom and Hess book, who point out that, of course, knowledge is a shared resource, but it's a bit different. That book is quite different from the main emphasis of Lynn's work, which is, of course, resources were common but depletable. And so this is just a famous scheme that's in the book, and that's sort of, and it's the difference between rivalrousness and exclusion. And we have these four types of goods, and you've all seen this, I know this. And the thing, of course, that I want to focus on is useful knowledge, which is sort of both low rivalrousness, actually you could argue almost zero rivalrous, and very difficult exclusion. It's not totally impossible, of course, but we all understand the difficulties here. You can exclude it from everybody, but once you give it to one person, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep it from being moved on. So what they point out, however, and that is, I think, very useful for this kind of exercise, is that the knowledge commons needs to be managed by some kind of a community. And you look at European history between 1500 and 1700, and it's sort of hardly a place in which a community is likely to emerge. It is extraordinarily fragmented, splintered between hundreds of larger and smaller political units with fairly hazy sovereignty. And to make it worse, many institutions within those political units still enjoy a great deal of autonomy. So at first glance, at least, you would argue that Europe seems an unlikely location for this problem to find some kind of workable institutional solution. And yet, I submit to you that Europe was the first and the only place to stumble, and this is probably the best word I mean, because none of this was really sort of planned, to stumble upon a solution. And what emerges is, to solve this problem, is a community that is both transnational and virtual. And, at second thought, and I added this after, in some ways, that's not so surprising as I first thought, because, of course, the medieval church has some of those characteristics, although it differs in many crucial respects. So this early virtual community is a community of scholars which refer to itself as the Respublica Literaria, or the Republic of Letters. And they basically include sort of the crème de la crème of European educated society, okay? Scientists, physicians, philosophers, mathematicians, and in some ways, as Heffernan pointed out, they should be, this is a community that is sort of fairly homogeneous, okay? Now, they were all educated, they were all literate, they were all religious, well, most of them were at least, but open-minded, I think most of them would have been, and they subscribed to a common ideology or culture that I will still explain to you. But the first term, the time the Republic, the term appears is in 1417, but it comes to its own probably in the first half of the 16th century with a number of leading figures, such as Erasmus of Rotterdam, Paracelsus, people like that, who helped form it. And I think it reaches its peak in the Age of Enlightenment. Now, it's an institution that for an economist, you could at least say that it was ex post efficient, at least efficient in the sense that it was better than any other solution that anybody came up with, even though it was not as efficient as you could design it in a perfect world, which of course we never can. I'm not so sure its efficiency explains its longevity. That's a dangerous inference to make, but the fact of the matter is it's still in fairly developed and mutated form with us. What is clear to me after some reflection is that there really isn't anything like this anywhere in the world. No other civilization, not Islam, not China, not any other place, came up with anything like this. So what it is above all, it's a community that shared, distributed, and evaluated knowledge. And of course, as such, it was the institution in which what we call today open science emerged. And this, of course, was pointed out in a wonderful paper about Paul David, who's here and who really inspired much of what is to come. Now, the main mode of communication in this age were epistolary networks or letters. And it's sort of hard to see how this could have happened if it hadn't been for that in the 16th century, continent-wide postal services, associated particularly with the family of Francisco de Tasso, or later became known in his German name as Franz von Taxis, and his brothers who established a regular postal service system in much of the continent and later throughout Europe. Now, this wasn't cheap, it wasn't particularly fast, as you might imagine, but it was far more reliable than anything existed, and these enormous letter writing systems that emerged owe a great deal to that. But of course, there are other things that we all know and love that clearly became part of this story. The printing press, although the role of the printing press is still something we could argue about. I think Eisenstein's book, which is the classical there, slightly overstates the case, but that's a different story. There is the heritage of the lingua franca. Of course, these Europeans all wrote for a long time in Latin. I think the lingua franca thing may be overstated because everybody gets away from that in the second half of the 17th century, and it doesn't seem to make much difference. All they have to do is translate books, and translations were coming forth from basically any important book that was published either in England or on the continent was more or less quickly translated, at least into French, and then most people, of course, did read French. And finally, in addition to these factors, there is the final fact of the existence of these sort of semi-autonomous organizations in which the Republic of Letters could thrive. And I'm thinking here about universities and later on academies and scientific societies who basically made their own rules, and particularly universities had a fair amount of sort of political independence of the state. Now, what this is not, I repeat, this is not a construct of historians or some kind of an imagined past. People knew that they were part of this. You know, Pierre Boyle, the famous French Huguenot philosopher who lived in exile in Rotterdam and started to publish in 1684, this newsletter came called Nouvelles de la République des Lettres, and he makes this point. You can read, I'm not going to read this out to you, but you can read this, and basically he describes what he is seeing, and this is as good a description of the of this community. He calls it an empire. An empire it wasn't, you know, this is, we're talking about maybe at the peak 12,000 members. That's late in the 18th century. It's of course not obvious to, nobody has a membership card. You have to understand that people sort of eventually become part of epistolary networks where people drift in and out, and there are people on the margins. So counting them isn't easy, but you know, it probably went from about maybe 1,000 members in 1600 to about 1750, 12,000 in 1750. And don't take these numbers too seriously because, as I said, this is not really a countable thing. Okay, but what emerges in these networks are sort of nodal figures. Okay, so they were known at the time already as intelligencers. Okay, and the most famous was a Prussian who lived in England called Samuel Hartlib, and later Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Society, and you know scholars like Marin Mersenne in France. And these people literally wrote tens of thousands of letters. And they would also sort of work as relayers of other people's letters. So one of them would get a letter that had some finding or some observation, and if he thought it was important, he would send it on to 10 people, a bit like these chain letters that we send out today. By the middle of the 17th century, journals finally become a part of their story, although they're not as central, of course, as they are today. We have the Journal des Savants and the Transactions of the Royal Society, both start appearing in 1665, and that is essentially the beginning of the scientific paper we all know and love. And so these people then invented, in that sense, open science as a transnational intellectual commons, okay? And it's something we still practice until our very day, right? Discoveries are placed in the public realm by publishing and claiming property rights, but not exclusionary rights. In some sense, we all understand it. In other words, I put a paper out there, I have property rights into it in the sense that I want everybody to know this is my paper, and if anybody uses it, they better acknowledge that. But I don't want to prohibit people from citing it. Au contraire, of course, this is what this game is all about. What's also worth pointing out is that unlike the medieval church, which from which it has some inspiration, but this is a formally non-hierarchical structure. Now, like every community, it had some superstars who are more equal than others, but that's informal. Now, what I think, this is Paul's, I think, a wonderful insight, this is built on the sense that there's a connection between one's reputation as a scientist and patronage. So patronage, of course, could be an appointment at court, or it could be the kind of patronage we get today, which is tenured professorships, which is also a form of patronage. And none of them, of course, got good examples of patronage were these sort of three superstars of this era, Galileo, Leibniz, and Newton, all of whom landed more or less cushy jobs based on their reputations. Assessment was carried out then, as it is now, by something akin to peer review, because providers of credit were unable to discriminate between good and bad knowledge, which becomes more and more difficult. But there's a whole bunch of sort of very famous other sort of stars, even if they're not the superstars, but René Descartes maybe counts as a superstar, but and they come from all over Europe. Also, Belgium, of course, contributed the great Andreas Vesalius in anatomy. The Netherlands had Christian Huygens as a scientist, but also this man Cornelis Drebbel, who was sort of on the periphery, but as an inventor, he actually was very much part of it. Hugo Grotius, or de Grote, as he's known in the Netherlands, very prominent member, and we can, on and on. Comenius from Czechoslovakia and so on. So, Paul's point, I think, is extremely well made, which is that this kind of patronage is correlated with this reputation for quality, and then becomes increasingly difficult for people who dispense patronage to evaluate the material, and so everybody depends on the assessment of their peers. We would today call them level evaluation, but this system is still basically in place and more formalized. And of course, that is precisely the set of incentives that make people participate and place their findings in the public realm. Now, not everybody plays this game, and so there's enough exceptions to make you think that there are other things going on. So here are two examples of two very famous members who don't belong. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who was a very well-to-do draper in Delft, But in his spare time, of which he must have a lot, he writes 560 letters to the Royal Society delineating his findings of microscopy. And of course, Robert Boyle, who really had no need of patronage because he was one of the richest men of England, and in fact, he dispensed it rather than sought it. And yet, both of them were very prominent members of this republic indeed. Now, this kind of notion of property rights really is kind of interesting. The peak of fame that you can achieve is have something named after you. So in economics, which I pick my examples, but we have the Solow model, and that would make Solow function, the Lucas critique, the Arrow theorem. These things are the sort of peak of the reputational terms. Now, what happens, I think, in the Republic of Letter, that is at some point there's a bit of a bifurcation happening. And so for that, the distinction I made in my 2002 book about propositional and prescriptive knowledge may come in useful. So propositional knowledge is basically what we roughly speaking call science. It's a question of what and why things happen, whereas prescriptive knowledge is a question about how. So this is prescriptive knowledge is basically a set of techniques or of menus recipes in a recipe book. And I would say that propositional knowledge or science follows almost exclusively the open science model, whereas prescriptive knowledge sort of bifurcates. Some of it follows the propositional model and basically places everything in the open, and some of it tries to maintain some kind of excludability, either through secrecy or through patents, but of course not both. All right. Now, the argument is, then that I'm making is that open science, as it emerged in this period, may have been one of the key institutions to subsequent growth, and perhaps one of these factors that everybody is looking for about what is it that set Europe apart from the rest of the world. And so it's in some sense, you could think of this as maximizing accessibility of knowledge to others who might want to use it. And there, of course, what they are really doing is what I would call carrying out Francis Bacon's program. Bacon's message to the world, or one of the messages to the world, is if you want to have economic growth, if you want to have, you didn't use those terminology, but it boils down to, what you have to do is place knowledge at the disposal of those who can use it best. So have scientists and artisans, people who know things and people who make things, communicate with each other. That's what this system does. Now his own view was that he thought it was more of a role for the state, which actually doesn't happen. So what are the rules of this community? Well, the first is it's an open community. Anyone within reason, whatever that means, could enter. In fact, so somebody like Leeuwenhoek is completely unknown when you start writing these letters, but the letters arrive, people read the letters, and after some suspicion and some, site visits, they basically say, yeah, he's one of us. And, so there are more people like that, but that's sort of the idea. All knowledge and data should be shared and placed in the public realm. And when somebody doesn't do that, famous case is, of course, the astronomer John Flamsteed, later on in the 18th century, another guy, Henry Cavendish. So many people could be problematic, and that creates something of a scandal. You are supposed to play by the rules, because this is an institution. It's in principle egalitarian, also a few of them, of course, do become idols and leaders. Birth and wealth may have counted for more than they like to admit, but at least in principle, they don't. As I said, priority conveys some kind of property rights, and this, of course, the age in which the first delicious priority fights start to emerge, the very famous one between Newton and Hooke and Newton and Leiden and Leibniz, but also in the Low Countries, for instance, the famous fight between Jan Swammerdam and Reinier de Graaf about the discovery of reproductive organs in insects. One wonderful priority fight. There are many others. And the reason why the priority fight is because the rules say the first one gets the credit. And that's something you all know. Now, all knowledge is contestable. There are no sacred cows. This is a major step forward. My view is that one of the great steps forward in Europe in the 16th century, after 1500, is the growing disrespect that Europeans show. How much are you going to tell? Okay, I thought I was already done. I saw some slide. They are really disrespectful of people who came before them, and to a point where in 100 years earlier you wouldn't have been able to get away with. Pierre de la Ramée, or Petrus Ramus as he was known, a French philosopher, basically was promoted on the dissertation entitled "Everything Aristotle Said is Wrong." A bit of an overstatement, you could argue, but that is kind of the notion. I'll come back to that if I have time. And finally, all new propositions were to be reproduced, checked, tested, and evaluated. And that too, of course, is something quite important. And finally, this is an utterly transnational community, okay? As Lavoisier famously wrote, the signs are never at war. This is a bit of an overstatement, of course, eventually they do, but at least the theory is it doesn't matter where you're from, whether you're from Sweden or from Italy or from France, your national origins do not matter, only the content of your message. And so, So it does create sometimes this sort of new ethos of science, and so Merton has these sort of 4 tenets of what he calls the ethos of science in his classic article, and these are basically all carried out by this community. Universalism, everybody can enter. Communism, we share the knowledge. Disinterestedness, which is basically you're taking purely scientific view. And finally, skepticism, which is there are no secret cows. And so what emerges from this is something I like to call the market for ideas. I'm not the first one to go up with the term, but it seems to be particularly appropriate here. It's not a real market in the sense that it relies on price signals to allocate resources, but it has some element of market in it. People compete and cooperate at the same time, right? Like in every market, there's competition and there's also cooperation. That's sort of a characteristic of markets. There's people who try to sell things, people with new ideas, and potential buyers, which is the audience, okay? And basically persuading somebody that my idea is right is equivalent to making a sale. And it rewards success somewhat unpredictably, and thus provides what we would call perhaps medium-powered. We have in economics low-powered and high-powered incentives. I would call these probably medium-powered incentives. And some of the most successful sellers, you could even refer to them as sort of cultural entrepreneurs, people who really changed the thinking of a large number of people. You can think of Martin Luther, John Calvin, Galileo Galilei. I mean, these are people who really affected the thinking of many thousands, and of course in the case of Luther and Calvin, maybe millions of people. Okay, so these are extremely successful people in this market for ideas. Of course, the market for ideas isn't just about science and technology, it's about religion, it's about philosophy, it's about many other things. And so the connection between the Republic of Letter and this market of idea is of course critical. And what it does above all, just to cast this in economic terms, it reduces transactions cost. And the way that works is basically that, new knowledge is placed in the public realm. And so it's tested, it's vetted by experts, by critics, who try to reproduce it and verify the findings. And therefore, in some sense, for the people who are not part of this community, who are potential users, it becomes more reliable. I say more reliable doesn't mean it's reliable, right? I mean, there's a lot of nonsense being produced. I would say most of the stuff is written probably nonsense. A lot of that is occult, astrology, alchemy, and on and on and on. But still, I think in the end, for the user, the fact that this knowledge has been vetted by experts and by the top people in the world, basically this is the best we can do given the state of knowledge in the world today. So the system isn't foolproof, and many erroneous views survive peer review for decades and centuries. And if that surprises you, you even live on Mars or you're a graduate student, but clearly everybody knows this. Okay, the peer review system is not perfect, but it's probably the best we have. And so much like democracy, I would say, it's a flawed system that was better than anything else we have. Now, is this the only place where it ever emerges. And, you know, markets for ideas, of course, do exist elsewhere. You know, there's one in China, there's one in the Islamic world, and even within the sort of spread community of Jews, there is some kind of a market for ideas where people produce ideas and try to sell them. But not all markets work equally efficiently. And this market, the European market, worked better than all these others. It is more competitive, it has free entry, and less restricted in the ideas that could be traded and could not be traded. Perhaps the most interesting point, I mentioned this briefly, but I want to come back to it for a second, for the market of ideas, is that there is a rapid decline in the received wisdom of the classical canon, or what they call the ancients. So they come out and they test these things against the knowledge, against observations and against experimental findings, and they're found wanting over and over and over again. So guys like Petrus Ramos, who I already mentioned, or even more insolently, Paracelsus, who made a habit of burning the sort of standard medicine, you know, written by Rhazes and Avicenna and coming down from Galen. He burned them in the central square to show his medical students this stuff, you know, is really garbage. His colleagues who are teaching this book were usually not impressed by this, but this is the kind of thing you start seeing in Europe more and more. Now, it's true that the entrenched authorities try to defend themselves in most places, but this reactionary movement in the end completely fails. That doesn't mean that there were local successes. You know, a few troublemakers like Giordano Bruno and Miguel Servetus were actually burned alive. A few others were hauled before court, not least, of course, Galileo himself. But by the time the Galileo trial happened, I think, this is sort of a rearguard action. By that time, by the middle of the 17th century, I think it's widely recognized by even the most reactionary ruler, at least north of the Pyrenees, I should say, that this battle has been fought and lost. Okay, the markets for idea will remain open, and it will not be. Now, the three foundational beliefs that the members of the Republic of Letters share, and that become critical to its future emergence in something which I would call the Industrial Enlightenment, is first and foremost the belief in the possibility and desirability of human progress. Now, this sounds sort of maybe obvious to us, maybe a little bit less obvious than it did 10 years ago, but still, hopefully, rather obvious. It is not obvious in 1500, and even, you know, there's a lot of debate about it, but this starts to emerge more and more as this a central story. The belief in the superiority of the moderns over the ancients, as I said, becomes clearly, although there too, there still are rearguard actions fought around 1700. And finally, of course, the sort of Baconian notion that useful knowledge is actually not just produced for its own sake, but it's supposed to do something for us. It's supposed to be applied to production and eventually, as Bacon famously put it, relieve man's estate, which is sort of early 17th century English for basically bringing about economic growth. Now, one of the things that makes this possible in Europe is this political fragmentation that I talked about earlier. Because what the political fragmentation boils down to is that the reactionary forces, some of which were, by the way, Protestant and some of which were Catholics, but they never could get the act together. There's this massive, what we would call in economics, coordination failure between the forces of reaction. And the net result is that when some reactionary ruler emerges in one place and suppresses innovation, you know, the most creative, innovative, original minds pack their suitcases and leave. And if you start looking at the biographies of the sort of leading intellectuals between 1500 and 1700, it sort of strikes you how peripatetic they were. They were incredibly footloose. They kept moving around. Now, moving around in 16th and 17th century Europe is no easy feat. I mean, you don't travel business class, but you know, these are long, heavy duty trips that took a lot out of you, but people still do it, and the consequences are obviously. And so what a lot of them do is they move around as soon as the political regime becomes too unkind. So the great Comenius, the great reformer of educational science in the early 17th century, moved around, read his biography, and it's sort of mind-boggling. He comes out of Moravia, but he spends part of his life in Poland, then he flees, the 30 Years' War, ends up in Sweden, ends up in London, ends up in Amsterdam, was even offered the presidency of Harvard in 1636, which he wisely declined, and so on and so forth. Thomas Hobbes, of course, wrote Leviathan in Paris, and on and on and on. So this political fragmentation, even so it makes perhaps the emergence of a community more difficult, in the end allowed the competitiveness of this market to be sustained. And so the question is, so what? Okay? It's not at all clear, yeah, I'm reaching the end. It's not at all clear that the growth of science in this era, which sometimes still is referred to as the scientific revolution, led to economic change. And here the reference is big literature, hundreds of books and papers so on, published in the last 60 years, and there's no way I can do justice to that. My view is that this takes a very narrow view of what the Industrial Revolution, the subsequent period of economic growth, was all about. The Republic of Letters and the emergence of open science in Europe affected technological progress in a much deeper way than in the question asked by one of my colleagues, which is how much science was needed to build a spinning jenny. If that's the way you think about it, then you can dismiss the notion of science altogether. If you're a little bit more broad-minded, you realize that, particularly after the inventing of the spinning jenny, science plays an ever-growing role in the subsequent history of industrialization in Europe, and that's, of course, what my book on the Enlightenment was all about. So let me just summarize, and then basically that's it. So the most important change that explains the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent economic takeoff of Europe is not property rights or a decline in transaction costs or the glorious revolution of 1688 in Britain, as has been argued. And instead, I would submit to you that it is precisely the solution to the commons problem of knowledge provided by the Republic of Letters that is behind this miraculous success story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for a very inspiring talk. Are there any questions for Joe? We're all flabbergasted, obviously. Yeah. Yes.
Can you give her a mic?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was the organizational structure in which informally there is no hierarchy, or there is no formal hierarchy, but informally there clearly is a hierarchy. And I'm just curious what you think about the importance of that distinction, because I think that this is true of a lot of institutions now, and one of the things I think it's kind of popular to do is to say, well, there really is a hierarchy here, because if you look, you can see it is. But I have the sense that it matters a lot whether the hierarchy is formal or informal. I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
It's very hard to have a, I don't need that. It's very hard to have a formal hierarchy when there's no real formal organization. This is a virtual society. It is located nowhere in particular. By the 1660s, you have the Royal Society and the Académie Royale, and so these are maybe little corps. But now, where the hierarchy comes in, of course, they do have superstars, okay? And particularly, you read the biography of Newton post the publication of Principia, and you sort of realize that there's a certain fawning, and people realize that this guy is bigger than all of them, and his word counts for probably more than. And so that kind of hierarchy exists. But I have a hard time seeing how within this institution itself anybody can order anybody something to do, or even impose its authority in a similar way as say had been done for centuries. By the way, evidence is produced, which is, what does Aristotle have to say about this? Or in China, what do the classics say about this? In order, with the way we do in Jewish learning, okay? We go back to the writers of ancient times, and we say, you know, well, here I found the quotation that proves my point. These people aren't looking for a quotation. It's experimental and observational data. That said, of course, you know, there is the Schaefer and Chapin book about Leviathan, which basically, yeah, well, people did carry out an experiment, but it really mattered. You would be believed if you had a certain standing in society, if you were respected, if you were a gentleman. Being rich helps a little bit too. So clearly, these people living in the 17th century, Castle, they can't help it. So the 17th century is like that. I mean, people are more different than they are now. But certainly, compared to the kind of virtual society that the Catholic Church is in the Middle Ages, it is very non-hierarchical. Right? There's no bishops, no cardinals, no pope, or anything like that. And in fact, after the death of Newton, it's very hard to think of a figure who sort of stands, who towers above all others in the 18th century. There's a bunch of sort of giants, but none of them sort of tower above the others. Not David Hume, not Diderot. I mean, I find it very hard to think of anybody.
Can you take the other mic? There's 4 more questions, so I think we're going to start there. Yeah, and I'll take this one.
Can I just ask one that's a follow-up to this?
Okay, fine.
It's just maybe a minor thing, but I know you talked about superstars in this hierarchy. Well, superstars are important, but you also talked about nodal figures who are responsible for relay points of letters. So it seems to me that there was another level of hierarchy where people were filtering information, right?
To be sure. You think of people like Arlene as coming in a lecture, right? So he can filter and stuff that he doesn't deem particularly good, he may not send on. But as every editor of a journal knows, and many of us have done it, if you can't do it arbitrarily, because a good paper, if you reject it and then it goes to another journal, then it also tells everybody, well, those guys rejected it, so you're constrained by that. So yes, there are these intelligences who are in that sense quite powerful, but they are constrained by the fact that this is an open market, multifocal, with many places where it's acting at the same time. And I think nobody really had the power to suppress anything that was considered to be heterodox or heretical. Things like that really that kind of terminology I think loses its currency in this period. That is huge, because how many societies do we know in which people are basically abandoning the notion of heresy or blasphemy or I mean, even today, there are lots of places in the world where by insulting the wrong authority can get you into serious trouble. I mean, if you go and look at what happened in China this morning, you get to see what I'm talking about. This is a very unusual phenomenon, and certainly is not the case in Europe before this. I give you one kind of striking point, which is maybe drives it home. What you need in the 16th century, what made it possible, is this massive coordination failure. If the powers that be can coordinate, it will not take off. And if you compare the sad fate of Jan Hus in 1415, who was executed because the emperor and the pope, who otherwise couldn't stand one another, that's a different story, but the emperor and the pope get together and they basically get this guy, betray him, Exactly a century later, Martin Luther does say something comparable to what Hus is saying. He gets arrested. Okay, that's the big change. There is nothing, by the way, inevitable about this. And you should stress this is highly contingent. There's no reason why this became inevitable. Because imagine lots of scenarios, including the success of the Spanish Armada in 1588, in which the powers of reaction would have completely occupied Europe. So, to some extent, if you want, there's a great deal of accident and good luck involved in this as well.
Okay. Yes.
Hello. I'm still surprised that you use the expression "a market for ideas." Why is it so important to call this structure in which knowledge is exchanged a market? It doesn't look like a market, does it?
Well, they're buyers and they're sellers, and they meet in a kind of, a virtual place. And I come to you and I've written this paper, and I come to you and I'd like to sell your idea. You can either buy it or you can refuse to buy it. Okay? In that sense, and I made other people's ideas who compete with me for your attention. And so the analogy is not perfect because there's no real equivalent to market prices, at least not in an obvious way, but exchange is happening, buying is happening, selling is happening, so the principle of the market seems to be correct. By the way, it's not just my idea. The idea has been has been around for a long time. We have all kinds of markets that aren't real markets necessarily. We have a marriage market, and we have other markets. So the term market is used increasingly to encompass or to include things that are quite using price figures. That's fine. If you don't like it, it's not really essential to the argument.
We have 3 more questions, Mayo, Charlotte, and Dave. I just would like, Joe, can you answer a little more brief because we have another talk on.
Thank you very much. I enjoy a lot the presentation. My question is, how does future look like from the past? And I ask this question because, yes, because you refer to the postal to the starting of the postal exchange, letters, and also the printing press, and how these technological adoptions were very important for the formation of this community. And now that we are in a moment of high technological invention with the internet, how do you think this could have such a transformative?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there have been a few big jumps in the ease and cost of communication and access in history, and the printing press is one, and the telegraph is another, and the internet is a third. And so clearly the internet is amazing because you have that. And so technological factors for continued growth are there. But as I point out, you need technological factors, but you also need cultural, political factors. So the future looks good technologically. Politically, I think it's a little bit, yes.
Well, I wanted to thank Joel. I enjoyed his repackaging of most of what I've written on these subjects, and it's nice to see it refracted through another intellect. I wanted just to reinforce the question that was asked, which I don't think was Joel's response was one which I could endorse. The metaphorical allusions to the market and the market idea are a projection of the view that the market is an efficient mechanism for the organization, decentralized action, which leads to socially productive notions. Now, the one area in which we know that markets behave and perform very badly is in connection with information as a separate property. And we know that it's quite possible that what you get is reputational feedback, which is then gives rise to the phenomena of being famous for being famous, that the process through which expertise re-examines and questions everything is antithetical to the notion that what the customers are willing to buy is the right thing, that this is expert knowledge, and so the whole notion that there is a special responsibility to not follow fashion is antithetical and is a problem within modern science, in which we have a limited number of preferred portals for reaching people and establishing reputation. So insofar as people are looking at things in which modern science is not working well, they are all instances in which they are becoming more like the markets for commodities. And therefore I think the promotion of an easy metaphor which is in the culture is something that ought to be resisted. And one of the notions that we don't have property in ideas, which is an idea which is antecedent to everything which you've discussed, which is a religious idea that the word of God is not possessed by anyone, but is something which is part of the common blessing and endowment of mankind, is an older notion, And the people in the Republic of Letters referred to this in their resistance to control and authority over ideas. So, to map it into the market space, I think is to, in some sense, invite people to undercut what one is really saying.
I mean, I hope people don't misunderstand why I use this market analogy. I am certainly not subscribing to the notion that markets are necessarily or even commonly efficient ways of allocating resources. There are cases when they are, there are cases when they're not. The market for ideas in particular is full of failures, and we shouldn't, you know, the biggest failure of all is that there is no obvious set of prices that clears it. And so in that sense, I agree with Paul, that the notion that this is a place at which people who sell things, who come with new ideas and try to persuade others of their ideas by writing papers, by writing a book, by standing, you know, on a soapbox in Hyde Park. I mean, these are different methods that are trying to persuade others. When I have persuaded you, I have made a sale. Is it efficient? I think the question itself, well, maybe makes no sense. I'm not looking for brand efficiency in any way. I'm just trying to understand a competitive process in which people buy and sell. That's the only reason I use the analogy. And I think in that sense, it's not a bad analogy, except if you sort of insist on taking it too literally. I've run into this resistance before. People do tend to question that, but I can refer you to, you know, 12 other papers that use the idea of the market for ideas and try to sell it at that market, including my colleague Scott Stern and many others from Paul knows. So it is people who believe in that the market is the basic mechanism of life. Yeah, but I don't think that.
I think we're going to go on for a long time still. Thank you very much, Joe, and for we do have another talk on, a very interesting talk by Bronwyn from the University of California, Berkeley, but also from the University of Maastricht, that's not so far from here, in the Netherlands. Her main field of expertise is the economics of technical change, but present day, not going that far back as Joel, I think. And currently she focuses, amongst other things, on the comparison of patent systems in the US and Europe and many other related issues. And she's going to talk today, we need to put it on somewhere, about the innovative intellectual property strategies for pooling knowledge and technologies in addressing global challenges. That's the one, I think. Okay. F5, we should do it.
Yeah. F5, is that, oh, this is a PDF, so.
With a PDF, I don't know, but you can just.
It's okay, I can do it. It's not a PPT. It's a it's a PDF, and the PDF has a different. I think. There's no electronic. Is this? Does this move the screen? No. I have to push the. Yeah.
There you go down.
Ah, that one. Okay.
If you want to point, there is a pointer.
Oh, okay. In case I need it. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers, Tom and I guess Paul was probably involved in getting me to come here too. This is my second. Well, it's not actually my third trip to Louvain-la-Neuve, but the first time I came to give an econometric seminar many years ago, when Louvain-la-Neuve, I think, really was Neuve. So the title, I like the title of my talk. It's not my title. I think someone else made it up. But it's very nice, but I think it's probably overly ambitious for what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to do is sketch a little about this research program that I have with a junior colleague, Christian Helmers.
on issues related to intellectual property, environmental change, and hopefully development, technological development, development in development countries. And then talk in a little more detail about a couple of examples of creating commons or trying to create pooling strategies using patents. They're quite different, the two examples, in many ways, and they're fairly, I think, fairly depressing, and in fact may not even be worth the amount of effort that we have devoted to studying one of them. But it's at least, you know, it's probably interesting to learn about. Now, the papers, I'm not giving all these papers, but the papers in this line of work are a survey of what we know about technology transfer and patent protection, and what might that say about green technology transfer, which is published in an obscure place as far as economists are concerned, namely the Santa Clara High Technology Law Journal. A work in progress, which is a paper, which talks about how firm and individual in patenting changed when the Eastern European countries joined the European Patent Convention to try to essentially to learn about what the strength of patenting did for some mid-level developing countries, changes in the strength of patenting did. And then the paper that I'll talk the most about today, which I gather Paul David has also had already referred to in his plenary talk, which is a paper on looking closely at the first eco-patent commons. And finally, we're also involved in studying patenting, particularly in pharmaceuticals in Chile, which is another mid-level developing country. It's in the OECD, but it's probably one of the less developed countries in the OECD. The work that we're doing with people at the World Intellectual Property Association. Okay, so so the background here is what economists will call a double externality, which is that the view is that the patent system from an economist's perspective, and I stress that this is the economist view of the patent system, is it essentially exists because it is useful to have, because if we didn't have it, people might not invest as much effort and time in inventing new things because of the fact that they can be, that the invention, what's invented, could be fairly easily copied by competitors, and therefore they won't invest enough resources in it. Now that by itself is a whole long discussion, and I'm not going to get into that about, you know, the reasonableness of that statement. But in general, I think we think that if there's any useful justification for the patent system, it's either that or it's something else, which we'll come back to later, which is that Joel actually mentioned this in his presentation, is that it encourages people to disclose information about inventions, because the disclosure in principle doesn't cost them as much, because they are able to exclude people from doing certain things with those inventions. The second externality, okay, so the first idea is simply that people tend to underinvest in invention without some form of intellectual property protection. Therefore, we think a patent system might be a helpful solution. The second externality is the notion that environmental benefit does not go to the people who invest in improving the environment. Some of it may go to them, but that in general it benefits others besides the people who undertake the investment, and therefore you might in fact get too little investment in environmental and possibly climate change mitigating activities. And I guess most of us look around ourselves and say, yeah, that's true. Particularly on the climate change side, especially if you come from the country that I come from. The idea there is that, well, okay, if we really wanted to encourage the diffusion of improvements, such energy efficiency improvements, carbon-free technologies, other types of pollution reduction technologies, then the patent system is not necessarily the way we want to encourage invention in that area, because the patent system by its nature tends to restrict output and to discourage diffusion because it raises costs, because it grants temporary monopolies to firms. Maybe quasi-monopolies. I mean, in many cases there are substitutes. But still, there's a kind of conflict between the patent system and the need for diffusion of green technologies around the world. This is particularly true in the development area because the benefits of climate change mitigation, for example, which benefit the entire globe, many of the things that we would like to see happen in countries, it should happen in countries where there isn't necessarily a large amount of income to pay for new technologies. And so the diffusion aspect there and the spread of making the spread of information lower cost is possibly even more important to us than in the developed economies, which, I mean, one way to say this is the developed economies have in many ways learned to live with the patent system. This is much less true in underdeveloped and developing countries. Now, the more you look at it, the more you realize how complicated this whole story is, because as I indicate on this slide, green technology is just almost anything. It comes from all the different scientific disciplines. Some of it's very standards oriented, the smart grid type things where you really need a whole system installed. It's essentially everybody who ties into it has to be compatible with it, et cetera. And then you have other very low-tech technologies where there are lots of different substitutes, things like these small clean stove projects and stuff like that, where you don't really have the same kind of need for a standard setting. So that's the background. The two things I talk about in this talk are sort of summarize two papers. One is to summarize the prior evidence on the role of IP protection in encouraging or discouraging technology transfer to developing economies. And I should stress the fact that I say IP, I really mean patents in this case, because that's where most of the research is. And quite frankly, when it comes to technology, that probably is, the role of copyrights and design patents and things like that is relatively less important. So there's effectively a survey here, and then I will hope to spend most of the time talking about the two attempts to offer access to patented technology that have made by groups of firms to essentially create some kind of commons. And I guess I'm hoping in the parallel session after this that Ed Steinmuller's chairing. It sounds like there may be some more interesting things for me to learn in this area. Look forward to that. So the two questions for research in the survey, okay, that we did, and we're not the only people to survey this topic. We just we were focusing fairly specifically on whether this had anything to say about clean technology. The first question was, if you have stronger patent protection in a country, does it encourage technology transfer to that country? So you can reword that and say, how does it affect the behavior of foreign firms, FDI, et cetera? In principle, you think if there's stronger IP protection in the host country, that it should encourage the transfer of technology from foreign firms, or at least not discourage it. The second question that we looked at was, does stronger patent protection encourage technology development within the country? And that's a question of how does it affect the behavior of the domestic firms in the country. This is all in a context where we're really thinking not about countries on the frontier, on the technology frontier. We're thinking about countries that may lag somewhat behind it. In principle, more intellectual property protection could encourage innovative activity in the country, but it also discourages some kinds of imitation of companies on the frontier, and it may inhibit learning and catch-up. And part of this is coming from the historical, I hesitate in a room full of economic historians, or at least, many I know. But part of this comes from the historical record, where we think that there has been imitation learning and catch-up successfully in some economies without certain types of intellectual property protection, notably among them my own country in the 19th century. The other, I refer to other useful surveys in this area because I don't really want to claim that ours is the first or by any means the best. By Lee Brandstetter, Keith Maskus, and then he wrote a background paper, and then the ICTSD and UN ICTAD put together a volume about IP and the implications for development policy. So I'll just summarize in 2 slides what we get from the economic literature. On technology transfer, the answers, at least from the econometric literature, are very clear. If you're a middle-income country and you already have some kind of innovative capacity, and there are many such countries and are capable of imitation, both technology licensing and foreign direct investment in your country respond to stronger IP regimes. Okay, so people are more willing to transfer in that setting. I say middle-income countries with innovative capacity. It's sort of, if you think it through, you can see why. If you're capable of imitation, then people are nervous about transferring technology because you can undercut them on price, and because your general income levels are lower, and your labor costs are probably lower. The quality of the technology has also rises. The quality of the technology transferred. Is it closer to the frontier, for example? And there's a shift towards some kind of market for technology, or towards licensing of the technology, which again means there's some innovative capacity and imitative capacity in the country so that you can do the licensing solution. With very low income countries, it doesn't really matter. Okay, you don't see much response. However, if you then ask firms what influences your decision to do foreign direct investment in a country or to license technology to a country, they don't rank patent protection in that country very highly. Okay, they rank other things typically more highly. The one exception is really advanced technologies and establishing R&D facilities. There they do care that the country that they're transferring technology to, or that they're establishing an R&D facility in, has good patent protection. So that's the first question. The second question is much harder. There's a lot more research, but most of it's around the world, cross-country, around the world. One thing we know about stronger patents, okay, they make people patent. This is not a very interesting result, but you'll sometimes see people quoting it as a stronger patents encourage innovation. Well, that's not true. It encourages patenting in general, especially by firms and countries on the frontier. That's not terribly interesting. You have a lot of trouble finding evidence of positive impacts of stronger patents on innovation, except in certain chemicals-related sectors, particularly pharmaceuticals. Many other factors matter. The studies that have been done are often very unclear, partly because we don't see enough variation in patent systems, so we can't ask how does this country compare to that country as a function of differences in the patent system. Today we see relatively little variation thanks to TRIPS. And the second thing is this, firms adjusting to changes. It takes a while for them to adjust. One thing we can say for sure is that IP systems historically have developed at the same time as the innovative part of the economy, which is to say there's a chicken-egg problem here, a serious chicken-egg problem. I believe that that's the story. The innovators demand IP systems, and eventually the policymakers grant them their wish. So there's an unanswered question which I like to raise because I think it's an important question, particularly under the TRIPS. which is, if you're in a developing country, do you really think that employing the marginal scientist or engineer, which may be a scarce resource because of brain drain and things like that, do you really think they're better employed examining patents or actually doing research and development or commercializing new technology or advising firms on the adoption of new technologies? I mean, I seriously question this drive to having a patent system in every country for this reason. I mean, but this I can't answer this question, but I'm suspicious that I suspect I know what the answer is. So now let me switch to talking about my two experiments. Sorry, one of the experiments is one we looked at. I don't claim any credit for the second one, but I think it's interesting to reflect on it too. So the two things I'm going to talk about are the Eco-Patent Commons, which was created by IBM and several other firms at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Yeah, see, always a challenge to remember what WCSD is, in Geneva, and there's a website, and this is located on their website. And the Green Exchange, which was created by Nike and a rather miscellaneous collection of other firms. And they have their own website, which is, I'll say a word or two more about later. So the Green Exchange, I'm going to summarize what I know about that from a paper from the people that have researched it, namely Gaffele and O'Brien for the ICTSD. So it was created in January 2010 by Nike. They contributed about 400 patents to it. The other participants are an extremely mixed group. It's a very mysterious. Yahoo, Best Buy, Creative Commons, IDEO, I don't know what they do, Mountain Equipment Company, which is in there for a reason. I think they make mountain bikes. Enginera, the Outdoor Industry Association, which may be related to the Mountain Equipment Company membership, Salesforce.com, and something called 2 Degrees. Now, Mountain Equipment Company, the reason this got started in the first place was because Nike had some kind of innovation in the shoe rubber, whatever goes into the base of the shoe, which was useful for making tires for mountain bikes. And they licensed the technology to Mountain Equipment Company, and then they thought, wow, this is a great idea. We should make this available to more people in the world. To this commons, however, only 19 additional patents have been added, some from Best Buy and some from University of California at Berkeley, which I think is dabbling its toes in lots of different open innovation type structures, open and the knowledge commons type structures to see whether it works or not. This organization actually offers licenses that can be look more like a market for technology license. Okay, they in principle offer a standard royalty-free license like the Eco-Patent Commons. Then they have this standard plus license, which is basically almost anything. You can write a geographic restriction, you can set up payments, so it's like a regular technology licensing license. And then they have something called the Research Non-Exempt license, which allows you to improve and patent for non-commercial use, but it's essentially designed for university researchers to do stuff with the thing. Now, I find that peculiar because at some level, if you get to a point, if it's going to actually be useful, whatever follow-on innovation is taking place and invention is taking place, and if it's going to actually be useful, eventually it's going to get into commercial use. And so at some point, somebody's going to have to write a license for the standard plus license. In practice, on the website today, if you go and look, there are only 2 standard things being offered, 5 standard plus, and 456 research licenses offered on the website. Okay, so, they have these types of licenses, but they only really offer one. Now, Gaffale and O'Brien have some research papers and also a nice policy brief in which they essentially draw lessons from what happened with the Green Exchange, the original model. And the lessons that they draw are that the traditional patent licensing model and the desire of firms to protect their inventions with patents is very strong. That people's mindset is set in firms is set around that, and it's very hard to overcome that model. Okay, many firms that they contacted that contacted the Green Exchange and that they talked to, and this is the most interesting finding, I think, confirms something we think we know, but it's always interesting. Want access to the people behind the patent, which is to say the inventors, to the knowledge that the inventors have, rather than just the patent. In other words, as many of us think, patents are some form of codified knowledge. It's incomplete. There is always tacit knowledge behind that whatever invention is in that patent that isn't transmitted in the patent, and it makes it difficult to use the information there unless you actually can access the tacit knowledge. And that putting people in contact, putting outsiders in contact with the inventors behind a patent is actually possibly the useful function of this type of exchange. And the final thing is, if you look at the website, you will see that it's essentially useless. Okay, so they started this thing, but basically all the website does is tell you the numbers I just gave you, which is the number of types of licenses they have. It does not tell you anything about the technologies that are being offered. In other words, the only way you can find this out is by contacting an individual and calling them up, which means, anybody who views that as a cost, or who just wants to see whether potentially there might be something interesting there, faces in effect a barrier to finding the information out. My guess is it's just not being used very heavily. That's, judging from what I saw on the website. And they put very limited resources into it, and maybe one or two people, into the project, which means that, it may not have been super serious. Now, that's that experiment, which isn't really a commons, and it isn't, there's relatively little free knowledge exchange in it. The Eco-Patents Commons is a little different. It may be almost too free in some ways. It was created in January 2008. It's the first patent commons that we can find patent commons of this kind that we could find. By IBM at the WBCSD. The firms can pledge patents related to green technology. It's extremely flexible, the definition, okay? They give some IPC subclasses, but actually, you can justify, as long as you can justify it, you can contribute it. 11 firms have done so. All 11 firms are from the so-called triad, which is to say Europe, Japan, and the US. The firms in question, actually I don't mention it on the slide, but it's useful to know. The key players are IBM, DuPont, Xerox, and Bosch, okay, which is a German auto parts firm. And DuPont is chemicals, and Xerox is Xerox. Xerox has a long history of knowledge sharing inadvertently as well as advertently. And I think this reflects that. They list about 120 patents on the website. That turns out, I'll mention later, that turns out to be 94 inventions, as near as we can tell. Now, this is the interesting part. It's available to third parties for climate change and environmentally related activities with an automatic royalty-free license. Okay, the ownership of the patent remains with the firm. It's not not licensing in that sense. I'm sorry, it is licensing. It's not. They're not giving it away. It's not a donation, and it's not tax deductible. So they're not getting a tax deduction out of this. This is a U.S. game, okay, which has largely been shut down by the IRS. But for a while there, firms firms and universities were taking useless patents and donating them and assigning random values to them and saying, well, we contributed this much. 5? Okay, well, that's probably fine. And the only right that the firm retains is the defensive termination right, which basically says, if you sue me over some other patent, I can sue you back if you're using my patent. Well, this is all very peculiar, and the reason it's peculiar is because there's no registration or anything. So you have no idea who's actually taken a royalty-free license from this from your website, which is bizarre. So so there's several puzzles. One is why not use defensive publication? If you're going to keep these patents in force, you have to pay fees. It's apparent that the firms do actually pay fees in some cases. The royalty-free license to all comers means they don't even know who uses the technology. And is defensive termination that valuable? Because that's the one right they've retained. Well, my feeling about defensive termination, my guess is, in the US there's a considerable amount of patent litigation, some of it very unproductive and illegitimate in some respects. And my guess is that the lawyers put this in because they just, the lawyers like to put stuff like this in. And that's why the defensive termination right is in there, because they're terribly afraid of frivolous lawsuits. There are critical views, which I quote there, and I want to move on, so I'm going to. Now, the important thing about IBM's view, in my opinion, is the last sentence here. They say it's a good thing because it will open up opportunities to collaborate with people that you might not otherwise have collaborated with. It is very possible that they do actually expect people to contact them directly with respect to some patent. And they are, in fact, thinking along the lines of the open innovation line, which is sort of the private part of open innovation, the Chesbrough line of open innovation, which is to say the idea that they'd like to interact with other people who are doing things that might work well with what they're doing. That doesn't mean that it's going to be on a commercial, a payment-free basis, but it means they would like to know about people working with these technologies and perhaps do something cooperative. So what we did was basically compare the inventions in these patents to other inventions held by the firm and other inventions in the same classes. This numbers keep changing. The reason the numbers keep changing is for a reason which I probably don't have time to explain, but I'll try. The 120 patents included some that were equivalents, which is to say they listed both the US version and the EP version, the European Patent Office version. When we went and looked closely, it took an enormous amount of time, but we found 94 unique inventions, priority inventions, okay? But there were 238 total equivalents. In other words, many firms had taken out patents in more than one jurisdiction on the same invention, perfectly legitimate thing to do. But it means you have to decide what are you analyzing, patents or inventions. The comparison that we did, well, I mentioned it already, and I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go past that. I'm going to summarize the findings. Yes, these patents were green. Okay, they were green patents were more likely to be pledged than other patents of the firm. Pledged patents tended to be narrower in the sense of covering fewer classes, technology classes. They appeared to be less valuable than the typical patent in the class, in the detailed technology class. They were pretty much indistinguishable from other patents in the firm's portfolio. So we compared them to the patents that the other patents the firm held, except they were more green, and they were much less likely to match the IPC pattern of the firm, the class pattern, the set of places where the firm patented. This, by which I mean, these patents were far from the technology areas that the firm specialized in, okay? Not central to firm strategy. That seemed to be, a big predictor of why they were going to be donated, meaning it wasn't value or anything like that. they are just as likely as the other patents held by the firm to be kept in force, in fact. So finally, we looked at diffusion. This is seriously problematical, all right? We can't tell whether the inventions are being used. We're particularly hamstrung by the fact that these guys don't register that they've even looked at the website, okay? That's a real problem, and I think if you're going to design these things, you really do need to get a little bit of information of that kind. What we do is look at whether these patents are cited before the donation and after the donation to the commons. Are they cited more or less? You know, in other words, we're looking for the diffusion of the knowledge within the patent system, which may not be a good place to look. The conclusion was that the patents are cited less before donation and also after, which is bad news about the possible value and usefulness of the patents. It is true that the people who cite them are more likely to be individuals or universities and nonprofits than for the controls, slightly more likely. They're almost all developed country institutions and authorities, patent authorities, okay, which is to say that doesn't, if you're going to measure diffusion to developing countries using this method, you're not going to find very much. This gives you the blue and the green. The blue is the eco patents, and the green is the controls, and you know, the non-eco patents in the same classes. And well, I don't want to hold you up. I'll just wave at it. The big dip at the front there, you know, so it looks fairly. That's got to be a data problem in the PatStat, the data, the source, the international source of data that we're using. So don't pay any attention to it. It's clear that they had some problem recording the sites at that point. What matters here is that the blue curve is well under the green curve, well before the date of donation, which is the red line. Okay, so essentially what's happening here is these guys, you could predict that these guys are more likely to be donated. They're basically less likely to be used, to have been used as sources of information for subsequent patenting by other people. Okay. And that's looking within a fairly narrow IPC class. So, you know, it's a match set. So let's, to finish up, the technologies were mostly related to environmental cleanup, mitigating pollution, and Bosch's patents are almost all about improving the efficiency of fuel-injected engines. They're not about electric cars. They're about parts for the gasoline-powered and diesel-powered cars. There are issues with the setup of this thing. 12 of the patent numbers out of 120 were wrong on the website. And it's now been fixed, but basically because we told them, right? Meaning nobody else told them. 1/4 of these, you can tell that they're wrong because you know the title of the patent, and you can actually do a search and figure out which patent they meant. 1/4 of these patents have been expired, rejected, or withdrawn, and 1/4 are not yet granted, but the legal status distribution for controls is similar, with even fewer enforced. So that doesn't tell you anything other than, you know, they're just the same, really. Do I want to repeat this? No, let's go. The overall conclusion. The overall conclusion is, so far, these commons or exchanges have not yielded much. Relatively few patents. Really, I mean, these were way down in fractions of a percent as far as shares of the firm's portfolio. I think 0.04% of the firm's portfolio. Patents are often not that useful by themselves. Those that have a really valuable exclusionary effect, those few that do, are not going to be donated by firms. Others might have useful information, but the information is often incomplete. It's hard to see the use if the users don't at least have to register, so that it's a little hard to study. I didn't mention at the beginning, there is clearly some public relations aspect of this, and I should have discussed that issue, although it's a deeper, it's not just that they're doing this. I mean, IBM has a very long detailed program of things that are environmentally oriented and which look partly like a contribution to the public good. And I think it is something that large firms do tend to do for legitimate reasons, not solely for window dressing. But this particular aspect of it doesn't look to me to be so far all that successful. Okay, I think I'm over.
Thank you very much. We're running a bit out of time, but I think we can take some of our coffee break for a few more questions. Bronwyn, yes.